Good afternoon, good evening. I am Zsuzsa Csergő, Director of Virtual ESN, and I'm here to welcome everyone to this event on the unrest in Northern Kosovo and the future of relations between Serbia and Kosovo. I know that I do not need to explain to this particular audience the seriousness of the question of why this conflict has escalated into the violent clashes in late May, what this episode of violence shows about the unresolved tensions between Serbia and Kosovo. We are bringing here to you three experts who have generously agreed to share their thoughts about the causes of the violence and also about how they see the potential for normalization between Serbia and Kosovo. I am thankful to Florian Bieber for inviting our guest panelists and also for participating in this conversation as our expert moderator. Florian Bieber needs no introduction in this community, but I'll do due diligence and I will highlight that he is the president of our association, president of vASN, and at the University of Graz, he is professor of Southeast European history and politics, and he's also the director of the Center for Southeast European Studies. And I am not going to take up more time. I will give the virtual floor over to Florian so he can introduce our guests, Stefan Surlić and Donika. Emini, thank you very much for joining us, for agreeing to be here at this time of your day in the evening to share your thoughts about this crisis with us. And I will return at the end to thank everyone, but I will disappear now. And Florian, it's over to you.
Thank you, Zsuzsa, for the introduction, and thanks to Donika and Stefan to join us on this panel. So just to briefly introduce the two of you, of course, the bios will also pop up in the chat for those who want to know more. Donika Emini has been active in civil society as an analyst, as a coordinator, as an activist in Kosovo for years. And she's a member of Bieber, the Balkans and Europe Policy Advisory Group, and has been an analyst with the group on issues related to the Western Balkans. And Stefan Surlić is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Political Science at the University of Belgrade, and he is also native-born to Pristina. So in that sense, we have, except for myself, all Kosovo panel, and we are going to be looking at not just the violence which erupted in recent days, last week, in Kosovo, and the fact that a substantial number of KFOR soldiers were injured, which has been rather rare in the over 23-year-long peacekeeping operation of KFOR in Kosovo, but also the overall political crisis which came to the foreground as a result of this, but also the background and the prospects. So we're going to have this conversation. All of the attendees are welcome to participate. You can participate by writing your questions in the Q&A function, and I will use those questions and discuss them with our two participants. So feel free to write them at any point in time. I'll try to group them, so please don't feel frustrated if I'm not able to immediately ask our panelists, but we try to also in a certain way keep a logical flow to our conversation tonight or today, depending on where you are. So we don't want to be a news network, so we don't need to look at the events of the last week. But of course, they come after a whole set of events which both of you have commented, have discussed over the months, and we followed them, from the supposed or agreement between Serbia and Kosovo normalization of relations to disputes at the end of last year over license plates. So in a certain way, without going back too far in history, but Donika, maybe what is your take? What is the trajectory? Where does this, where does this come from, the violence now? What is in a certain way, the background story over recent months, which has led to where we find ourselves at this particular point in time?
Hi, well, I mean, it's almost good evening for me. I'm from London now. Well, it's my pleasure to share this panel with you, Florian. Unfortunately, we just talked about this issue a couple of months ago, and we have been sort of focusing on the future and of the dialogue, especially after Brussels and Ohrid. And obviously, happy to share this panel with Stefan. This is a new counterpart from Serbia for me, and I'm very happy to explore my network there. Unfortunately, this is not new. I mean, obviously this time it was more serious because we saw tensions on the ground, which included wounded KFOR soldiers. And if you look at, the history since 2000, there was no wounded soldiers of KFOR in Kosovo since its deployment. So 20 years after the war, we are seeing tensions on the ground to the point of, violence escalations, protesters going against KFOR, which was a bit sort of sending a very negative message. Because we have normalized violence, we have normalized this, tensions and flare-ups in the north. That every time we do it, we actually go a level up, and we are testing our situation on the ground, which can lead to something very serious. This time it felt more because not only because of the fact that we have been dealing with crisis since late 2022. You mentioned the crisis with license plates and all, but also because of the fact that there is a war in Ukraine. So we have already a war in Europe, which is exhausting the diplomatic and political sort of capital of the West to deal with yet another, sort of soft spot security-wise. So what we've seen in the past is the fact that in the Balkans, we're not talking about reforms anymore. We are not talking about Europeanization. We're talking about security. So we're back to what we witnessed in the 90s. We are seeing an EU that was unable to finish what the US in a way started in the 90s. And now we see like all about US involvement being the party pressuring towards Kosovo predominantly, but also Serbia. So, for me, there are three elements that are important to mention now. The fact that it is very unfortunate that this is happening 1.5 months after Borrell said we are out of crisis prevention, crisis management mode. Now we are managing a crisis. So what we did in Brussels and in Ohrid doesn't matter, because it was even drafted in a way that it left us with a lot of question marks, both the agreement in Brussels, but also the follow-up action plan in Ohrid. There is also one element. When we actually spoke, when we were in Brussels and in Ohrid, we knew that there are 4 municipalities without mayors. We knew that there are elections. Kosovo postponed the elections once to give space to the Serbs to think about it and come back to the public sphere, because we need the 4 mayors to actually form the association. So we talked about the association, but we didn't talk about the ingredients that we need to actually form the association. So, everything seems unplanned, and it's kind of sad to see that the EU and the US did not learn a lesson yet. And obviously the parties on the ground share no political will to actually engage anyone in the process. The second one is the incremental approach does not work. What Borrell said was that we are opening yet another negotiation phase, which can last up to 10 years probably, because there are, serious issues being discussed. So with this incremental approach, the EU is not going nowhere. I mean, obviously we're ending up in tensions. The third one is that there is no political will, but there is no strategic thinking as well. So we have EU and US, which is trying to sort of maintain the status quo until it blows up. And then we have parties which share no political will to do anything on the ground. So that's why we're having tensions, because for all the parties, it's kind of more convenient to sort of engage in this stabilitocracy cycle rather than do something that is meaningful in the process. What we've seen now, and we're seeing today still, because the protests are ongoing, is a wrong policy that the EU and strategy that the EU has followed in the case of Kosovo-Serbia dialogue. And one key message that we shouldn't continue nurturing stabilitocrats or autocratic, leaders like Ivan Vučić to sort of make it possible for them to be accommodated as much as possible, just for the sake of short-term stability that they are offering. Because this is also mirrored by other leaders in the region, be it Kurdi or even other countries in the region, trying to sort of play the stability card with the EU, because it's easier than talking about democratic reforms.
Thanks, Donika. So, Stefan, how do you see it a certain way, the chronology of, or the pieces, how they led us to where we find ourselves today, or with the events of last week?
Thank you, Florian, very much for the invitation and for having me today. Also, Përshëndetje, Donika. I will continue, what Donika starts. I think we are witnessing a paradox. On one hand, the situation in Northern Kosovo is experiencing tensions like never before in the past 12 years. And on the other hand, Belgrade and Pristina have reached an agreement that has the potential to completely change the dynamics and normalize the situation on the ground. So the crisis is happening in the north because I think both sides lack the interest to implement the so-called European proposal, which on one hand entails the application of association of municipalities with Serbian majority, and on the other hand, membership of Kosovo in international organizations. So additionally, also it involves mutual recognition of all documents and the implementation of previous agreed upon measures, including also documents like IDs, license plates, mutual recognition of diplomas, etc. So I'm confident that both Kurti and Vučić are currently not ready to implement the European proposal and the Ohrid agreement. And the internal political situation in Kosovo is such that there is no political option that would support the implementation of the association of majority municipalities, so including Vetëvendosje and opposition parties. Kurti, as the main critique of the Brussels agreement, wants to avoid the formation of the association by any means. And on the other hand, Vučić knows what to expect in case the association of some majority municipalities is formed. First, the demand that Serbia does not block Kosovo's membership in the international organization. So, taking into account the current protest of the opposition in Belgrade, the strength of the far-right movement, as well as the nationalist factions within his own party, Serbian Progressive Party, I believe that he does not have the political power to implement all provisions of the so-called European proposal or Franco-German proposal. So I miss, in terms of political power, that that opportunity was missed in 2018 or 2019. Therefore, this situation secretly suits both of them, even though if it may not be coordinated. They have, I think, a similar way of thinking. They do not see ordinary people. They don't see Serbs in North as citizens. They see territories. That is why Vučić proposed so-called territorial partition or delineation. Kurti recently spoke about the loss of square kilometers where Albanians lived for centuries. So they treat Serbs in Northern Kosovo as citizens in terms of Pristina, but when you ask representatives of self-determination movement privately, if they would accept Serbia regaining control over Northern Kosovo in the event of Albania and Kosovo's unification, for example, they say they would, of course, accept it. So that is why the story of citizenship, equal citizens, multi-ethnic society is without content. It's just a facade for both Kurti and Vučić. Both of them are nationalists and see just territories. And regarding North, I think Serbs in Northern Kosovo are victims and hostages of both sides. Belgrade blackmails them and demands loyalty. People are manipulated through jobs and financial benefits. and Pristina, on the other side, forcibly wanted to integrate them. That's, I think, wrong politics from Pristina's side, because the action of Kosovo Special Police units is a demonstration of force. The politics of authorities in Pristina is to present the event as completely ordinary and expected activity. I think that Kurti also in his interviews for CNN emphasized that mayor going to his workplace, that this is a normal thing, that municipal building is a place of service to citizens based on laws and the constitution. But if there were indeed a minimum of political consideration for citizens of Serb nationality on the north, I think that several facts would be taken into account. First, that after the war, Pristina did not ensure a multi-ethnic character in any city south of the Iber River. Second, that 10 years ago, promises were made to the north and other municipalities with a Serbian majority to form the Association of Serb Municipalities in accordance with the Brussels Agreement. And third, it is impossible for local authorities to be a service to citizens in environments where over 96% of the population does not accept them. And we are all convinced that their existence is just temporary until a comprehensive solution is reached on the north, establishing an association of Serb municipalities and total integration of Northern Kosovo in Kosovo system.
Thanks, Stefan. So I think you started out with highlighting the kind of paradox we find ourselves in, that we have a situation where there is an agreement which is, well, we don't know whether it was signed or whether it was agreed or how to term this agreement, but which actually opens the door, at least in theory, to the normalization between relations between Serbia and Kosovo, which has the idea that in exchange, and I think this is important for those who are maybe not following the events regularly, in exchange for the establishment of the Association of Serb Municipalities, in essence, Serbia would stop blocking Kosovo's membership in international organizations, and there would be a exchange of representatives, which would be similar to diplomatic relations between the two countries. And again, all of this is always mentioned on the example of the German agreement of the 1970s, which meant diplomatic recognition in all but name for the two countries. So in a certain way, the parameters, and I mean, many of these ideas have been around for decades. In fact, even before independence, I remember during the Troika talks, which led after the Ahtisaari negotiations, this idea of the two German treaties was already on the cards and was already discussed. So we're talking about ideas which are at least 2 decades old, or maybe 15, 16 years old. So nothing new in many ways. And we know in a certain way the direction of travel. Clearly, there isn't much which can be invented to make it work, but still it doesn't seem to work. So, well, in fact, I mean, the question maybe to both of you is, why did the respective prime minister or president sign or not sign or whatever, do the thing they said they did with these agreements? If in fact, Stefan, we take your point that they're actually not that serious about these agreements, why did they even commit to them? Why did we have this, why did Kurti sign up to this agreement if he's not really that interested in forming the Association of Serb Municipalities, which is part of that agreement? And Stefan, you mentioned as well, Vučić is unable to deliver or unwilling to deliver on the question of stopping Serbian breaks on international recognition of Kosovo and signaling Serbians' acceptance of something there which is not, under Serbian government control. Why have both of those political leaders signed up to something like that when in fact they're not really that interested in keeping up with it? Donika.
Well, before I go there, I would just, like to sort of add to what Stefan mentioned in relation to the Serbs in the north, but also Serbs in Kosovo in general. The fact that, Vučić, I mean, even the establishing the association would not solve the issue for Vučić, because there would be something else. Because genuinely, Vučić has not been engaged in the process for the sake of improving the local, the lives of the local Serbs in the north, and that's and all over Kosovo in general. I mean, when they talked about territorial exchange, like Vučić could not care less about a huge amount of percentage of Serbs actually residing in the southern part of Kosovo. What will happen to them? I mean, what's going to be, what I mean, we talked about this territorial exchange and land swap idea quite a lot of times, and that would solve the issue, territorial issue for the northern part of Kosovo and its residents, but what would happen to the southern one? So that brings me to the point of Vučić did not care about the local Serbs as much as he cared about using them to install an instability pocket in Kosovo. Because if you look at the region, there is one in Bosnia and Herzegovina, there is clearly one now in Montenegro, and there is always the Kosovo issue. And this brings me to the point of, Vučić being the one that actually controls the stability in the region, which is, something that the EU is desperate about. And that has been, basically the main point of your theory, Florian, the stabilitocracy, the one that you constantly exchange stability for something else that, brings you leverage in the game, which then brings me now to answering your question. And also, like in the north, unfortunately, both for Kosovo and Serbia, it has been used as a ground for establishing negotiations position, because for Vučić is like very clear. There is the north, there is people that are actually directly challenging Kosovo's authorities and statehood. And, he installed this game in a way that every time Kosovo wanted to gain something in the north, they had to create tensions. And these tensions are not new. If you look back in history, when Thaçi did it in 2011, for instance, the first tension that we actually witnessed after, serious one, after just before or while the Brussels dialogue was going, the technical phase, it was, to gain the control over 1 and 31 crossing points to establish this administrative border between Kosovo and Serbia. So every time Kosovo wanted to do something in the north, they had to create tensions. And that's how we fell into the stability trap that Vučić sent. Because this brings me to the point why Vučić is engaged in the dialogue. First of all, it was face-saving. After the ICJ, there was this way for Serbia to maintain this negotiations over the status of Kosovo open, because there was Kosovo declared independence, and then there was the ICJ decision. So in 2011, they started this process, but then something else started, which is very important for Serbia, the EU integration process. So if you look at, how the EU sort of interlinked us, which then brings me to the point how effective the EU conditionality is to not only steer the democratic reforms, but also solve issues, statehood issues, and all of that, which the EU sort of tried to juggle, but it didn't manage to. So for Vučić, the more he engaged in the dialogue, although it with no interest in implementing, with no interest in solving the issue, the more he progressed in the EU integration process. The more he kept, open the Kosovo-Serbia issue, the more there was an open gate for Russia to meddle directly with the West, because obviously what we see in the North now is not just Kosovo and Serbia, but it's also Russia and the West. It has been always geopolitical, right? So then for Kosovo, it is something that Kosovo always had to do. Like, of course, in Kosovo, it was desirable to close the process with Serbia in 2008 and then 2010 with the ICJ decision. But this wasn't the case. Obviously, we had to sort of see how to navigate around our neighbor Serbia without being recognized and how to bring us to the point of recognition. So then we engaged in the dialogue because there was this pressure. For Kosovo is always like, if the international community says so, there is no option for us. Kosovo has no leverage in the process. It was, it was an imposed process in which we engaged. Now, in the beginning, this process was sort of mainly led by a person. There was around one person, which was Hashim Thaçi, but now that person is gone. So Kurti inherited the process, which he did not agree at all to even exist. And then, of course, about the association, which he not only did not agree, but he built this negative narrative around it by calling it a zajednica. So then Kurti now is like completely new. In the beginning, he tried the game of these are not my agreements, hence I won't implement them. But obviously this wasn't an option because there was Brussels noted in which he was actually sort of obliged to agree. And then Kurti sort of started steering the process by bringing up a statute of the association, a draft which he allegedly, because we haven't seen the document, provided to Lajčák. But, like there was no serious sort of engagement in the process. So when Brussels and Ohrid happened, in a way, both parties were praying for the other one to actually opt out, so they wouldn't be the one to blame. So the entire process of negotiations wasn't, like, let's sit and talk about the future of our countries. It was, let's see how we just throw the ball into other parties' court, so then the EU and the US will blame them and not us. And this is what we have today. So what we have today, unfortunately, now is all the pressure going to Kosovo, hoping that the association will, the establishment of the association will solve and will just please Vučić and solve the issue. Unfortunately, that is not going to be the case. While Kurti is dealing now with all the pressure, even if something happens and the association is formed, I'm sure Vučić will find something else to increase his leverage in relation to the EU. And this brings me to the main point. There is no incentive to solve the issue. Germany's might have worked in the past because there was NATO-EU process. There was like something bigger happening, steering this process from behind. But in the absence of EU integration process, there is no incentive. For Serbia, there is just financial incentives, and Serbia gets quite a lot of money from China, Russia, other parties, the liberal parties, which doesn't make EU any good player or unique player in this case.
Thanks, Donika. So, Stefan, would you agree that neither of them actually wanted an agreement, and they, played a chicken game basically in terms of, hoping the other wouldn't agree, and then when they were both stuck with an agreement they really didn't want?
Yes, I think that the main concern is whether the Ohrid agreement between Kosovo and Serbia is another potential unfulfilled commitment. After all, an agreement is just as good as the parties. So, and the track record of Kosovo and Serbia in keeping promises is disappointing. So our leaders, I think, are well known for making and especially breaking promises, and that also questioning also Ohrid agreement. Sorry, do you hear me? Yeah,
we hear you now. Yes,
yeah,
thank you.
we're witnessing some changes because what determines the agreement success or failure is the level of the US and EU engagement. And the bad news is that Serbia's President Vučić and Kosovo's Prime Minister Kurti will not do anything substantial voluntarily. The good news is that both responded positively to EU's and US resolute take it or leave it. And that approach in Ohrid, reflecting their vulnerability to international determination. And I really think that put the right pressure and our leaders would go further and faster. But what was the problem with the Ohrid agreement is that there was too much focus on how to sell its content rather than on how to improve the quality of the content. And how to sell to our nationalistic backgrounds, how to present to our societies, and of course, and Kurti and Vučić both feeding ethnic hatred, and that is problematic. Ethnic polarization is at high level, and of course that we are witnessing public skepticism about the agreement implementation, and of course that we are witnessing absence of support because on one side, we have the EU and the US are trying to build support for the process, but that is proving to be an unsuccessful battle even for the two superpowers, because, for example, one of the carrots is the EU membership. EU is using membership to the Union as a magnet for the parties, but parties know the EU prospects are weak, and Kurti and Vučić are sure their countries will not be able to join the EU while they are in power, so as to claim the credit for it. So Kosovo's and Serbia's leadership don't care as much about long-term interest and long-term goals like membership in the EU. I think also that both Kosovo and Serbia want the agreement to fail for sure, both Kurti and Vučić. Maybe perhaps Serbia wants failure more in the hope that it gets a better package later, especially in terms of the territory. But also Kurti is totally against association, and that is very problematic. If I could add, please, just to remind about Northern Kosovo before the crisis, because we cannot say that it was fully integrated, Northern Kosovo, into the Kosovo system, but you had Serbian police officers were wearing uniforms with Kosovo state emblems. Then Serbian judges who took an oath before the president of Kosovo and worked according to Kosovo laws. And you had local self-government elected according to Kosovo laws. Then Kurti said, totally unexpected, that there is no Kosovo state in the north, just because Serbs drive cars with license plates issued by Serbia. And he threatened to confiscate vehicles if they were not changed within a specified deadline. And there was resistance from ordinary citizens. And I really don't understand the position of either side. First, the Serbian side, which believed it was defending Serbia and Serbia's territory as southern province through license plates, alongside judges, police, and mayors, totally integrated in Kosovo system. And second, the Albanian side, represented by Kurti, who was so aggressive that he jeopardized all the years of integration after the Brussels Agreement. And what is the end result of Kurti's policies? Northern Kosovo, today, without police, without judiciary, with high level of presence of NATO forces, then without legitimate local self-governments, and worst of all, without Kosovo license plates, because that was his promise at the beginning.
Thanks. I would before we're going to turn also to the role of international actors and how we assess them, but I want to take a brief, kind of look at domestic politics in both countries in terms of, how this fits in. I mean, maybe we begin with you, Stefan, because of course what happened in the context of the largest protests President Vučić has faced during his 12 years in government, protests which had nothing to do with Kosovo and were about 2 mass shootings and were protests against violence. Now it happened in the same time. So he has a substantial people on the streets who are critical of him, but a very weak opposition. And we all know his rule has been and become increasingly autocratic. How does what is happening in Kosovo fit into his rule? I mean, in terms of, you mentioned earlier, the nationalist forces are vocal, but maybe not so strong. When they called for a protest on Autokomanda in Belgrade, a few dozen people or so showed up. It wasn't, a mass protest, so they are unable to really get people on the streets for this issue. But they are very vocal in their attack of Vučić as a traitor, as a selling out Kosovo, and so on. Is there, in a certain way, how do you see his behavior towards the issue in Kosovo, towards the unrest linked to domestic politics, and how important are really the nationalist critics of his rule?
I think that it's presented by the opposition in Serbia and especially nationalistic parties and movement that Vučić have total control over Kosovo situation, especially on the north, that he have he has a blind followers dominant in the north, and that he's manipulating with Srpska list or Serb list. But I think that something changed completely with this mass protests in Belgrade, because they are not convinced that non-democratic leader could bring democratic outputs, especially towards normalization of relations between Belgrade and Pristina. So we have different approaches regarding Kosovo status and future Serbia-Kosovo relations. But whole opposition is convinced that without democracy we could not achieve reconciliation and normalization of relations. So even we are witnessing opposition in the north. There are several important spheres of society present in the north. The first is as we mentioned, Serb list, but the second consists of political options with totally different backgrounds. Also, there is groups like civil society and medias, very strong group. We have a very positive example, appeal from over 100 Serbian intellectuals from Kosovo, totally independent, addressed to the government of Kosovo, but also government of Serbia. It's also interesting that you could hear how citizens both in Belgrade and Mitrovica on protest level decision makers as traitors. So that could be a very tough issue for Belgrade, because for example, if Belgrade were to ask Serbs in north of Kosovo to participate in elections, again, without any guarantees from Pristina regarding the better status, or starting with implementation of association, I believe Vučić would also be labeled as a traitor. So from different parts of the society, not just nationalistic, but also very liberal.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Donika, turning to domestic politics in Kosovo as well. I mean, Kurti has come under quite from the his ignoring a very strong Western suggestion not to send the mayors to the municipalities. It's been kind of very vocal criticism. So it's been in a certain way a kind of, while at the same time the opposition parties have been also skeptical about the Serbian municipality, the Association of Serbian Municipalities in the past, but the kind of there is not a consensus in Kosovo that in a certain way in the larger dispute that Kurti did the right thing, so to speak. So how is domestic politics in a certain way playing out for him? Is he coming under pressure because of what he did in sending the mayors to the north with special police forces and the response he received? Or how do you see in a certain way this domestic dynamics?
Yeah, it's confusing, to be honest. I mean, since the very beginning when Kurti took over, it wasn't an easy journey for him, because he came with a jobs and justice kind of slogan, aiming to send a message also to the EU that my focus would be internally, developing Kosovo, but also installing democracy. But at the end of the day, for the EU, it was more a matter of pressure to deal with the Brussels dialogue and with Serbia, rather than focus on the reforms. And this is also like the trade-off that the EU has done, in the past as well. So this is not new. Before I go there, then this also sort of links to what Stefan said in relation to the north and how Kurti approached it. What Kurti did in the beginning was, okay, let's see what are the soft spots. How can I install my position in the negotiation? Like him being the new prime minister of Kosovo, leading the Kosovo the dialogue from the Kosovo side was a new thing to the international community, and obviously to the US. which has been kind of very, very lukewarm towards Kurti, sometimes even negative towards his position in the process, but also to the domestic sort of audience, also in relation to Vučić, because we have seen this previous sort of Vučić-Thaci sort of relation, which was different. You know, it was at some point they started talking to each other in like using first names, you know, and, you know, it was more kind of informal, and you could see this communication sort of happening differently. Just and you know, then Kurti looked at, okay, what are the things that I can, you know, sort of use to launch myself in the dialogue, and then obviously the co-registration plates, and, you know, the reciprocity, which was, you know, sort of a thing that has been also endorsed by the US and the EU, because it's kind of leaders of Lista Srpska pressuring people in the north, but also like creating this negative narrative towards those who actually accept to register their cars in Kosovo, burning down cars, you know, not from Lista Srpska, but, you know, creating that environment in which, you know, if your car has registration plates from Kosovo, then, you know, it gets burned. But then driving to Pristina with car registration plates, RKS, Republic of Kosovo. I mean, this is a circus. A circus is a fact that Lista Srpska resigned from the parliament alongside the police and all, but then Lista Srpska returns to the parliament, but the police do not return in the north. Because, you know, it's a pick and choose. It's like, okay, how do we increase this, you know, pressure as much as we can on Kurti's government? You know, like it doesn't make sense for the way that, you know, how a political party strongly linked to Vučić's regime sort of pressures on even people who were not try not to boycott the local elections in Kosovo, because we have seen, you know, even Serbs sort of running as opposition of Lista Srpska, but in the end they withdrew. So you can see how difficult the situation is. So even Kurti, you know, or any government in Kosovo, even if they wanted to sort of include the local Serbs, would have been almost impossible because of the pressure. I mean, look at the 4 municipalities. The North Mitrovica one does not have any problems. There are other 3 that actually have problems, and that's because parallel structures have parallelly coexisted with Kosovo structures. That's why the access to municipalities is a problem, not the fact that we are having Albanian mayors, but the fact that we have this parallel institutions cohabitating with Kosovo institutions. They were hybrid. So the integration was flawed. I mean, it wasn't perfect, obviously. And the integration of the Serbs in the north did not fail with Kurti, unfortunately. It failed before. It failed the moment Vučić and Thaci and Alba Forum said, let's be open to the land swap, because then local Serbs were like, okay, we have been integrating, but now there is another option. So I think that shook the foundation of the actual integration. And then obviously Kurti with, you know, sort of persuading this, okay, let's intervene through interventions, integration through interventions, police interventions contributed to the frustration on the ground towards his government. And then, yeah, for Kurti, it was extremely difficult because he's not open even to us in Kosovo. I mean, there is not a lot of debate happening in Kosovo about how do we establish an association if we want to, and how will that look like? So it's not just with the local Serbs, but in general, the process has been so hermetic, so close to the rest of us that we don't even, you know, now it's like the entire debate is black and white. And like, we can't even like agree. It's so polarized that we can't even agree to sit and talk about it, and let alone to have a draft document and discuss about it. It is reached this point. So for Kurti internally, what happened is that he couldn't deliver on jobs and justice, because obviously disentangling state capture cannot be done. I mean, we have seen the case of North Macedonia. It can be done. Some elements are there, but like you can't be successful fully in achieving that. And in the Brussels dialogue, he did his best to sort of utilize on you know, what he could to sort of establish his position, but also follow to what is happening in Ukraine and really play this, you know, or flag this Serbian alignment with Russia. Obviously, even after 1 year and more, you still have Serbia unwilling to impose sanctions, and Kosovo, who has been quite pro-West in the narrative. But then, obviously, what he does in the dialogue is very tricky, because if he agrees to be constructive, he's a traitor. because he has been going against his principles, and against his principles would be the establishment of the association, or although he wasn't very, very close to it because he started this debate sort of minimally by sending a draft to Miroslav Lajčák, but we don't see that so much for being inclusive as a process. But then, you know, if he does not, like in this case, is not, you know, sort of backing off in the north, then he is the problematic guy who creates fissures with the West, with the US and the EU. So whatever he does internally, he's very much criticized. And he's trying to sort of balance all of this and navigate through this by, you know, trying to come up with a solution. As of now, I mean, I don't know what is the purpose of, you know, sort of intervention in the north in the 4 municipalities, and what will the future look like. It is very unclear, obviously, but domestically, I think that his position in the Brussels dialogue is only being criticized by a few, not even by the opposition, to be honest. The opposition is playing very safely, because the opposition is the one that actually signed the ASM, signed the Brussels agreement. So it's inherited by Kurti. So the opposition cannot criticize something that they have done in the past, as much as Kurti cannot, you know, now sort of do what he criticized in the past. So in Kosovo is like a very, very shaky situation. What is happening in Kosovo now is that we are not talking about, okay, what is our attitude towards this process, but it's like, what is the US and the EU saying? And are we strong enough to actually go against their pressure? And, you know, this is bothering a little bit, because now we are not even, you know, sort of creating an environment in which we have a say. We take the lead in the process, but we're rather sort of waiting for the EU-US. And today, Rama even came up with a statute for the actual ASM, completely an outsider in the process, not even understanding the issue properly. He came up with a statute. So, I mean, this is the situation in Kosovo. And what bothers me is that, you know, like, we are turning a blind eye on what's happening in Serbia. In Serbia, for the first time, we're having protests. I was happy. We were all proud. I mean, you including Florian, with a number of protesters in the streets in Belgrade, challenging Vučić's autocratic regime. And unfortunately, by the EU and the US, we're not talking about that. We're not talking about, okay, there is a, you know, majority of people taking the streets, because that's the only tool that they have against this regime. But we are talking about the association and the crisis in the north. And this is, you know, the absurdity of, you know, the Balkans. So in terms of, you know, his stance towards Serbia and the dialogue, I think Kurti's position internally or his support will not diminish. On contrary, you know, it was always the Brussels dialogue that it's strengthened his position, and that sort of even incentivizes the leaders to rather talk about the dialogue and not about the reforms, unfortunately.
Thanks. I mean, this is, I think, one thing we do find in general is these questions, which are highly contested, take over from issues of domestic reform. I mean, what you mentioned, the jobs and, you know, jobs and economic growth in Kosovo, or the democracy agenda in Serbia. It also, I think, the other thing which I think you mentioned, Donika, is the lack of an inclusive discussion about the dialogue, or about what it entails in both countries, about, you know, there isn't a space for a nuanced discussion, but rather it's either you're for or against, or again, proposals made in secret. Now, I mean, it comes to one of the first questions which is raised, which is by Afrodita Krasniqi, about the, you know, the role of international actors, and let's bring those in. You know, to which degree, I mean, we've had, I would say, unprecedented critical voices by both the US and the EU towards the government of Kosovo. In the past, usually the criticism was kind of both directed at both, but in recent days, the criticism was much more strongly directed at the government of Kosovo rather than at the Serbian government. I'm just kind of now would be curious to hear both of your take of, you know, where do you see the main weaknesses of the international involvement. I mean, we have this much more substantial international involvement than we had earlier. I mean, you both mentioned 2018 when land swap was on the card. This was the Trump era. This was when Federica Mogherini lost an absurd control of the envoy squad on the other side, both of them kind of being very active in this dialogue. But again, we are in this crisis moment. So in a certain way, what did the US and the EU do wrong that we end up here, looking at the international actors in this equation? Stefan, what do you think? Where do you see the weakness or the kind of strategic errors of both these international actors that we found ourselves in this situation? Or did they do everything right and it's just that the local actors, kind of didn't really care what they wanted?
I would be brief. I hope that EU and the US will change approach. I think that EU should set clear timelines about what each party should do and when, because we don't have agenda of the implementation. Then they should also put the mechanisms in place to make sure the implementation is done on time. We are still witnessing so-called constructive ambiguity. For example, what is self-management? Do we consider self-governance when we mention self-management in the document? Then the EU and the US should be clear on the association, especially about its powers, clarifying all ambiguities, and perhaps offering its own draft. If Edi Rama could do it, then also, and Albanian government also, I have heard that people, decision makers from North Macedonia. So perhaps also the EU and the US could offer a draft when the parties obviously are unable to agree. Also, I think that they could continue with the pressure. Serbia should consider that in the spirit of the Ohrid agreement, tomorrow vote for Kosovo's membership in the different international organizations. Also to remove pressure on Kosovo Serbs, and that is impossible without clear international condition. And also, I think that pressure from internationals should be focused on Kosovo's government to explain the association, to be totally clear on the association and in which form will be implemented, and finally to start so-called internal dialogue, because Albin Kurti mentioned it at the beginning, that he will announce internal dialogue with Serbian community. Maybe the first day of new mayors after new elections could be meeting with Pristina's government and concrete talks on statute of association.
Yes, I remember internal dialogue was also something which Vučić talked about, and I think there wasn't much dialogue happening. But anyhow, so Donika, you also already earlier suggested some of the ways in which I think it sounded a bit similar to what Stefan mentioned now, where the EU and the US have not been effective with this continuous negotiation approach.
Oh, I mean, first of all, I'm more sort of, I mentioned before, like we have a completely securitized situation. If there is securitization, of course, the US involvement, sort of increases. So what I am disappointed with is the fact that from 2011, the EU left, the US left the European issue to EU to fix it using its membership conditionality. What happened is that we just saw a weak EU unable to actually know what they're doing. Like they didn't, like not only failed to sharpen their conditionality toolbox towards in the Balkans, but they also aimed at, and have like built this ambition in peace negotiations, in international negotiations, and had the Brussels dialogue with all this structural diplomacy sort of in their hands. And then they failed to deliver. What they've done is that they engaged in this, incremental approach, constructive ambiguity, in a way, just trying to maintain the status quo, desperately not to see war in the Balkans. So whenever we complained about the lack of success, their question was, but, you're not killing each other anymore. This was explicit. It happened to me in Brussels, and that's not a success. That was something that the US has reached through NATO intervention in the Balkans, and it's not a success that Brussels should be aiming for. So what we see now is re-engagement of the US, because, there is Chris Hill in Belgrade, so we don't have just anyone appointed in the Balkans. We have people who are, have been there during the Yugoslav crisis, who know the Balkans and its complexities, and will try to sort of steer the process. And what we have on the other side is an EU trying to just align with the US, but in the case of Kosovo-Serbia dialogue, during these tensions, they were hiding behind the US. Especially in Kosovo, because in a way they changed. They sort of, it was a division of labor. In the case of Serbia, there was EU sort of using its leverage through Chapter 35, a new integration process. In the case of the EU, there was, if Kosovo, there was always the US, because of course they considered that their leverage is stronger in Kosovo. And this was, sort of was thought well to be functioning in the beginning, but obviously it failed to do so. So now we're seeing the EU and the US responding only after the war in Ukraine, because they're afraid that something will happen in the region. What they're trying, what doing it, they are completely short-sighted, unfortunately. So they don't have a long-term strategy in terms of, how do we bring these parties close to actually signing a final deal and close this issue, but rather just engaging in, okay, how do we accommodate the strong leaders in the process so we can guarantee some sort of stability? This is the case, unfortunately, with the US, which has been sort of obsessed with sort of the alleged Kremlin lack of diplomatic capacities to engage with Serbia, to sort of turn Vučić and Serbia towards the West. I'm not talking about the people, I'm talking about the regime. And they're trying to accommodate whatever Vučić wants and says in order to achieve this. And then we have the EU, which is obviously lukewarm, does not have a lot of incentive, because obviously, as I mentioned before, there is no integration and membership incentive there. And obviously, the EU has not really done quite well in relation to North Macedonia. So that was, I guess, also a very problematic issue, because witnessing North Macedonia changing its name and doing all this that the EU wanted it to do, and again, not even being granted the accession negotiations immediately after, was a bit of a turn-off for the rest. And also, unfortunately, we only saw Macron and Scholz getting engaged when there was tensions on the ground, similarly to when, the land swap idea sort of surfaced. The EU member states and all this strategic autonomy and all this, ambitions that the EU has, especially in the Balkans, has failed to materialize. So now we are just having a lot of pressure on Kosovo, hoping that, Kurti will establish an association. Then what? Who knows what's going to happen next? And then Stefan mentioned, and rightly so, the mechanism to monitor the implementation or the violation of the agreements. But Serbia immediately violated it by explicitly going, against Kosovo in the Council of Europe, but also in the UN membership, which was asked, what would you do if, Kosovo would want to join these mechanisms? So, what the EU lacks is obviously political power, strategic thinking. It lacks incentives, and it lacks an approach that is, okay, now we're going to use everything that we have, all the leverage that we have, and we're going to come up with something that is really, really going to change the situation on the ground. For me, it was very disappointing to see that with all the sanctions and all this blackmailing in a way that the EU and US were doing to the parties, they came up with the Brussels arrangement, because it's not an agreement, it's not fine. So if they use a maximum and that got that very problematic document, then, you know, like, this really worries me about the future. So yeah, more robust engagement of the member states, actually thinking strategically, what after the association, and will that change the situation on the ground, or do we need to approach it in a different way? Incrementalism didn't work, and it would be stupid, being very blunt here, to sort of continue using the same strategy, knowing that it will eventually fall apart.
Thanks, Donika. I think you mentioned a couple of key points. I want to kind of two issues, which also some of the questions raised. One is, of course, the incrementalism. You know, when does the increments end? What is there an end point ever to the negotiations, or is this eternal negotiations? And this brings me to the question which David Cannon raises about the association, which also is echoed by some other questions, which is, to which degree can you actually imagine such an association to be, enable the integration into a democratic civic Kosovo, or is the fear of a new Republika Srpska a legitimate concern? And I guess it's in a certain way the question of, is this then the end for, it's the negotiations between Serbia and Kosovo, or is this going to continue afterwards? And what does that mean? I mean, about border changes, is this still really in the background, or, a certain way, can this be the final institutional arrangement within Kosovo, which then allows for a situation where Serbia comes to live with an independent Kosovo? Stefan, what's your take?
Yeah, I think that the association of municipalities is a major issue. We can all argue for and against it normatively, but it is something that has been agreed upon. We cannot build trust between two sides if what has been agreed upon is not respected. So Kurti claims that it is one of many unresolved issues, and that there are over, 30, 40 agreements. Experts have analyzed and found that only 4 to 5 agreements are difficult to implement, while everything else has been formally accepted by both sides. About energy, mutual recognition of diplomas, etc. And this means there is a room for agreement. Unfortunately, the association, decentralization, and any form of autonomy have been demonized in Kosovo. Two narratives have been created in Kosovo. First, that the situation in the north is actually a struggle over whether Kosovo will become like Croatia or Bosnia in the future. That is the wrong dilemma. Kosovo cannot be Bosnia, with 94% of the population being ethnic Albanians. Simply put, Serbs with 4 to 6% cannot and do not have the capacity to threaten Kosovo statehood. They live in 10 municipalities, mostly in villages. Territory is not connected, without proper infrastructure. When we compare with Bosnia, Bosnia has a classic power sharing system. The right of veto at the central level, and Republika Srpska with executive, legislative, and judicial powers. The association means autonomy in 4 areas: healthcare, education, local development, and urban planning. Nothing more. It is an association of municipalities. Also, the second very frequent agreement is that in Kosovo, that even with a limited authority, the association can endanger Kosovo due to the pressure from Belgrade. Belgrade's pressure can always be manifested. So look at the current situation. For example, Belgrade, without Serbs in institutions, still influences the situation on the ground. Why? Because people feel loyalty to Serbia. This could be changed, but through an inclusive policy from Pristina, not aggressive integration. So understanding the situation, gradual integration, ensuring that healthcare and education function smoothly. And I really believe that no one in Kosovo, from ordinary citizen side, think that if Serbs have their own separate spheres of life, including healthy care or education, it affects the statehood of Kosovo. So we need to change the situation on the ground, and the most problematic is, of course, north of Kosovo, but all open issues should be resolved in Brussels. And Serbs in Kosovo will not believe that the government in Kosovo protects them from crime if the streets are filled with special police forces. If you have checkpoints and bunkers on roads, if you confiscate land of farmers to build large military bases, then the space becomes securitized unnecessarily. So the consequence could be the mass exodus of people from the north. And if there is a massive depopulation, especially of young, talented people, no one in Belgrade will be willing to implement any agreement. So the Serbian community is actually a bridge between Serbia and Kosovo, and both sides are trying to endanger and blackmail it. But if we offer association, I think that we offer totally different frame for Serbs, and we open the space for full integration in Kosovo society.
Thanks, Stefan. So Donika, do you also see that, a Serb association can function in Kosovo? And especially, I think Stefan mentioned Serbia's role in Kosovo is there irrespective, or can be there irrespective. And we've seen it and of course, when you look at education, Serbs are not integrated into the Kosovo system since the end of the war. So in a certain way, it isn't anything new. And having an association might be a greater level of integration than we've had actually in the past. So is this really a way forward and something which can, which could open the way for some kind of normalization, or do you see too many stumbling blocks in this coming about?
I don't necessarily agree that, like Serbs getting autonomy or getting, like on the areas mentioned, especially relations to related to health or education, it might be seen as a problematic issue for anyone in Kosovo, to be honest, because the Ahtisaari package already offers a lot of rights. I mean, we have double majority in the parliament. So if you look at the parliament in Kosovo, you can't change anything that is in the constitution. The constitution has been, like a document that derived from the Ahtisaari plan, which has all, the UN minority standards included, deeply embedded in it. So basically in Kosovo, you can't change anything that touches even 1% of the right of minority, Serbian minority in Kosovo, because Kosovo has been built in multi-ethnic, but the documents and the system favored the Serbian minority and against the other minorities living in Kosovo, obviously, and that's has been further sort of highlighted with Brussels agreements, because obviously in northern Kosovo, it is specifically said that the director of the police should be of Serbian minority, disregarding the fact that there are also Bosniaks living in that part of Kosovo. So everything has been built in a way to ensure that there are rights, and obviously there have been shortcomings in implementing the Ahtisaari plan, and now we are having sort of the association which looks like Ahtisaari plus. In terms of the association, I don't think that anyone in Kosovo has a problem with it actually being formed as according to the Constitutional Court decision, because there is a Constitutional Court decision of 2015 which basically looked at the agreement and looked at the points which actually were against the constitutional spirit. So there is some sort of document which that it has some red flags towards some issues, but even Kurti and Osmani many times have, sort of declared to form the association following that document, following that decision of the Constitutional Court. But that is something that, clashes with which sort of envisages as the association. I mean, if you treat this case as, using Vučić's strategy, then maybe the association might be the end. Maybe the association will bring peace between Kosovo and Serbia and that closure between Kosovo and Serbia, because Vučić has built this transactional narrative. Every time you talk about Kosovo, but also with the, in relation to the EU or reforms, what will I get if I do this? So it's a transaction. I mean, this was also the logic behind the land swap idea. It was, okay, I will recognize Kosovo in exchange of some territory, so I can tell people in Serbia that I've done it, and at least we got something out of it. And this is also the narrative with the association, but we don't know, because we can't really have a very genuine talk with our political leaders to actually plan a step-by-step sort of process in which we will see the end. Unfortunately, that is something we didn't see in February when Borrell announced the Brussels arrangement. He said, like, oh, we are paving the way for yet another negotiation process without an end, without principles, without time frame, using the incremental approach. And that is the problem, because after the association, there might be something else coming up and already sort of being a deal breaker about the situation on the ground. In Kosovo, obviously, there is like a black and white discussion. As I mentioned before, there is, of course, a Croatia model that is very, very, light, and then there is a Bosnia model, which is, possibly the worst case scenario in relation to Kosovo. There have been many cases in which we discussed about South Tyrol, we discussed about the German plan. We discussed about models, and it's okay to steal elements from the model and create something which would be sustainable and which would be implementable on the ground. But unfortunately, this is something that I'm very skeptical. I mean, I cannot trust the process to the point like, okay, for the association, the problem will be solved. Unfortunately, because we are dealing with Vučić here, and this is transactional sort of attitude in the process towards the EU and also towards Kosovo. Anything that can be used to maintain the conflict in Kosovo open and instability pocket open, in which would increase his leverage internationally, he would gladly do it. I mean, again, what I would like to see in Kosovo is, of course, taking full-on responsibility for what has been signed before and what has been agreed in Brussels, but it is kind of impossible to do all of it, because there was this decision to boycott the elections in Kosovo, and we don't even have the mayor. So who's going to talk about implementing the association, or even talking about forming the association, if the key ingredients are missing? And so,
thank you.
While it might look like the association is the end, unfortunately, it doesn't look like it.
I think the issue you raise is very much that maybe it's not the association in terms of the substance, but it's really the concern about the process, which is the big challenge. And I think this comes back, of course, to the whole structure of the negotiations by the European Union, which has seen this as this open-ended, seemingly never-ending process, which of course is a problem, because it always creates expectations down the road of, will there be another round about talking about something else? We are coming to the end of our talks. I would like to give both of you a last chance for a round of responses. And I would pick two of the kind of a theme which Bojana Zorić raises in the questions, and Ilira Luli, which is both the context of the Ukrainian war, the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Because, I mean, Bojana asked, how do we place the normalization of relations in the context of the war in Ukraine, in particular, I guess, in the context of the West is distracted, but also on the other side, it can't afford, when it comes to, for example, the issue of KFOR troops protecting Kosovo, it can't afford not to do that, because, of course, this has larger geopolitical implications. It also sees, and I think some of the criticism which has been put forth at the EU and the US has been that they have looked at the conflict through the geopolitical lens rather than trying to resolve and improve relations between Serbia and Kosovo. It seems to be a lot about trying to limit Russian influence over Serbia, which again has very different motivations than improving relations between the two parties. So as a last round, how do you see this conflict in the, does the war in Ukraine, Russian aggression in Ukraine, make it more difficult to actually move forward because it creates this whole other motivation, or is it actually take this more seriously and try to resolve this in a more sustainable way than we've seen to date. So last round, and you can also pick up on anything else you would like to add, but let's just be brief, Stefan, and then Donika.
Thank you. I think that, yes, of course, war in Ukraine and Russian invasion, in fact, whole Western Balkans region, especially Serbia-Kosovo relations. Considering the situation on the north, we see that the conflict is still a possibility. I think that Vučić and Kurti have to walk a fine line between keeping their electors at home happy and meeting international demands, but always having in mind that the peace is the value. We underestimate the peace, and our decision makers, they just think about their very close interests. They try to find some narrow lines in their nationalistic rhetoric, but that just fueling populism and also could fuel direct conflicts between Albanians and Serbs. We need reconciliation. We need a complete political agreement and implementation of different political agreements. And in the end, I think that both Serbs and Albanians in these times when the conflict is, as I could say, open as an option, would appreciate mature leadership that does not gamble with their future, with their peace. Maybe these publics to society still don't know what mature leadership looks like. But once if ever they see it, they will like it and support it. And for now, it is still easier to really frustrated Serbs and Albanians around saying no to good relations, no to peace, no to sustainable agreements with the former enemies, then to figure out something they will say yes for peace, reconciliation, and not to allow third parties, including Russia and others, to influence some bad scenarios. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefan. Donika, over to you.
I mean, the war in Ukraine, unfortunately, of course, heightened the stability game in the region. And then, as I mentioned before, it's securitized. Now, we're not talking about anything, but let's try to come up with anything that would just prevent us from having the war. So even like if it's maintaining the status quo, it's okay as long as we don't have tensions. And that's the shortcoming, like a short-sighted approach. I mean, I don't think that there will be a war in Kosovo, in between Kosovo and Serbia in form of military intervention, because there is KFOR mission. And obviously, it didn't play well for Vučić having protests going against and attacking on NATO soldiers. That's why immediately we saw this change of narrative, because, like they started playing games with protesters instead of, fighting, because it really escalated very bad. And this is, basically a situation in which you nurture hate for so long that when it escalates, it gets out of the control. And for me, that was very scary, because if you had NATO members or NATO soldiers responding to the protesters, how would it look like? It would look like NATO is attacking on civilians in Europe. That would definitely play well for Russia and its narrative. I mean, it constantly drew parallels between NATO intervention in the Balkans with what they're doing in Ukraine. So basically, the war in Ukraine created this window of opportunity, unfortunately, geopolitical one. So we are not talking about, reforms, democracy, we're talking about geopolitics, which, I think both Kosovo and Serbia should have used it while we have all this attention from the international community. Because, I mean, tensions in Kosovo and Serbia are normalized, unfortunately. Now, every time we read about it, we're like, oh, yet another one. So like only the war in Ukraine brought the red flags and really seriously made us think about it. So I think, it's the right moment for the EU to actually be serious in solving this issue. Because I mean, with all the due respect, with the EU capacities and conditionality and tools and everything that they have, if they can't have success in the Brussels dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia, and in the Balkans, which is significantly smaller, we have issues, but we don't have as much as the Eastern Partnership region has. The Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, I mean, in its own, like they all are, like cases which are considerably more challenging than the Western Balkans. So if we don't have success here, we will definitely not have success there. So it's a wake-up call also for the EU, but also for the parties to actually engage seriously and really, close this issue. Unfortunately, what I see on the ground is a short-sighted strategy, which is probably just going to continue maintaining the status quo rather than having a solution to it. What also is like understandable, I don't agree with many issues, especially the way that the Kosovo government intervened in the north and the last round, but it's like, it is very difficult to negotiate with a person with probably the only leader alongside Lukashenko supporting Putin in what happened in Ukraine. Only in Belgrade we saw people supporting a war in Ukraine, supporting Russia, and a leader which, in spite of being part of this EU integration process, advanced in the accession negotiations, failed to comply with sanctions. And it was flagged in the EU progress report for Serbia, unfortunately.
Thank you, Donika. I think we've come to the end of our conversation. I think a couple of key takeaways before I hand over to Zsuzsa for last words would be that the current process overall seems to be not leading to the results we're hoping for. I think the crisis has highlighted that maybe the issue, the kind of proposals on the table are not the problem, but it's really the kind of open-ended nature of the process and the lack of trust between the parties. The fact that the process is not inclusive in societies and there isn't really a broader dialogue really allows for suspicions, sometimes justified, sometimes unjustified, to linger and to escalate. So I think we have a larger challenge, and I think both of you have mentioned the kind of securitization, which keeps making it difficult to talk about substance, and one talks about just security issues. And I think the responsibility for that does not only lie on the shoulders of political leaders in the region, some which have less democratic legitimacy and problems, such as in terms of their role as President Vučić, others who have also been significantly escalating it, but also the US and the EU, who've been not really finding the right language in addressing this. So I'm afraid that we will have to have another round of this conversation in 1 or 2 years, but hopefully with slightly better outlook at that particular point in time. And with that, I'll hand over to Zsuzsa for a few concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Florian, and thank you, Donika and Stefan, for this really substantive discussion that raised issues but also helped us to understand a little more about the complexity of this crisis. As a comparativist, I found the takeaways on the stability of the cost of democracy that was discussed in several parts of this conversation, particularly important at a time of major crises, obviously the war, which has created also an excuse for securitization, an excuse for the stabilitocracy that Florian wrote about, that also Donika mentioned, that is obviously happening with actors that are more interested in their own hold on power than on democracy. And of course, all of this is taking place at a time when there is democratic backsliding also going on. And so we are not ending on a very hopeful note, but at the same time, I think there's an urgent need for people to understand the sources, because without that understanding, and without the understanding of the complexity of the conflict, there's no way that resolutions could be found, because then we are all contributing to this black and white polarization that the leaders are actively creating. And so I'd like to thank you for helping us to complicate the understanding of what goes on, especially for those of us who have a much more superficial knowledge about the conflict than you do. So thank you very much. And thank you to all of you who have been with us. And I want to remind everyone that these webinar conversations are recorded. They're archived. You can just Google virtual ESN, get on the website. You can watch it again. You can use segments of it for teaching and look at past webinars as well. And come back to virtual ESN. You will find announcements about future events and also consider joining the ESN community as a member. This is a wonderful community that is studying, discussing, debating issues of great significance. There's plenty, unfortunately, of issues in the world going on around nationalism and conflicts like this. So I would like to thank everyone and have a great day and good evening, depending on the time zone you're in.